Hey guys, tonight we are pulling back a curtain that has been nailed shut for over 100 years. You think you know Laura Ingalls Wilder. You grew up with her. You carried her books home from the library, dog-eared the pages, maybe watched her on television. The little girl with the braids and the sunbonnet, running through fields that smelled like wildflowers and hope. Laura Ingalls Wilder, America's pioneer sweetheart, the woman who made the frontier feel like home. But tonight, you are not meeting that Laura. Tonight, you are meeting the real one. The one who arrived in a small Minnesota town in the spring of 1890 with nothing but a sick husband, a 3-year-old daughter, and exactly $150 to her name. The one who had just buried a baby. The one who had just watched her house burn to the ground. The one who had just spent 2 years ploughing fields with hands that bled because her husband could no longer stand up straight. Tonight, you're meeting the Laura who spent an entire year living on her in-laws' charity, sleeping under someone else's roof, eating someone else's food, folding herself quietly into a household where she was not the daughter, but the disappointment. And she never wrote about it. Not once. Not in her books. Not in her memoirs. Not in the letters she carefully composed for decades afterward. 1 full year of her life, one of the hardest years she ever lived, vanished. Erased. Buried so deep beneath the mythology of calico dresses and fiddle music that historians had to dig it back up with their bare hands. This is the year history forgot. And we are going to walk through every single day of it. Yeah, drop your city and your local time in the comments below. Tell me if you already knew this story, or if tonight is the first time anyone has told you the truth. Get comfortable, dim the lights if you want, and listen closely. Because what happened to Laura Ingalls Wilder in Spring Valley, Minnesota is one of the most human, most heartbreaking, and most quietly remarkable stories the American frontier ever produced. And she tried her best to make sure you would never hear it. You are standing in Smet, Dakota Territory. It is August 25th, 1885. The air smells like dry grass and horse sweat and something you can only call possibility. The kind that hangs in the air over new towns that have not yet had time to fail. Laura Ingalls is 18 years old today. She's wearing a dress that is not white. She refused a white wedding dress because she had already decided she would wear it again as a regular dress, and white cannot be worn on a farm without turning the colour of defeat. That detail tells you almost everything you need to know about her. She is practical. She's unsentimental about pretty things. She's watching the future the way a farmer watches the sky, not with hope, exactly, but with calculation. Almanzo Wilder is 28. He is tall, broad-shouldered, and known across Kingsbury County for 2 things: his Morgan horses and his stubbornness. He drove through blizzard conditions to bring wheat to a starving town 2 winters ago. People still talk about it. He is the kind of man who finishes what he starts. The kind who bends his back to the earth and trusts it will bend back. Or the wedding is small. Reverend Brown officiates. There is no party. There is no dancing. Laura would later write that she removed the word obey from her vows because she intended to be a partner, not a property. Almanzo apparently did not argue. That detail also tells you something about both of them. They settle on Almanzo's tree claim, about a mile from town. The claim requires him to plant trees on his land, maintain them, prove up over the required number of years, and then the land is his. 160 acres of Dakota prairie sky and wheat and wind and whatever a man can pull from the earth before it pulls him back. Almanzo is confident. He has Morgan horses. He has muscle. He has Laura. In 1885, that seems like enough. For about a year, it nearly is. Rose Wilder is born on December the 5th, 1886. She's healthy and loud and already, at 2 days old, destined to remake her mother's legacy in ways neither of them can imagine yet. Laura is 19 years old, with an infant daughter, in a one-room claim shanty on the Dakota Plains. The wind outside sounds like something alive and angry. The stove burns wood that costs money they do not have much of. But Almanzo is working hard. The wheat is growing. The horses are strong. There are evenings in those first years when the 3 of them, Laura, Almanzo, baby Rose, Sit in the lamplight of that small house, and it feels almost exactly like the life the books would later describe. Warm, simple, earned. But the books would be lying. Because underneath the warmth, underneath the lamplight, the Dakota Territory was already sharpening its teeth. The Prairie did not forgive debt. It did not forgive bad weather, or bad timing, or the kind of small miscalculations that would be manageable anywhere else. In 1886 and into 1887, drought settled over the region like a hand pressing down on a chest. The wheat that had grown tall and golden the first year came in thin and pale and wrong. Almanzo replanted. He borrowed against next year's crop. He told Laura it would be better next season. And Laura listened, and said very little, because she'd grown up watching her father make that exact same promise to her mother, over and over again, in different states, under different skies. She recognized the sound of it. She knew what it cost to believe it. She believed it anyway. Because what else do you do at 19 on the Dakota Plains, with a baby and a husband and 160 acres of hard earth? When the alternative is admitting that the dream is already dying, you plant more wheat, you mend more clothes, you write letters to your family that are cheerful in tone and spare with the truth, and you wait for a winter that does not come too soon, a spring that does not come too late, a summer that delivers what the last three failed to give you. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was brutal. The summer of 1887 was dry. The crops came in short again. Almanzo refinanced. He took on more debt. He kept moving, kept working, kept believing, with the particular stubbornness of a man who has not yet reached the moment where stubbornness tips over into delusion. But the horizon was coming, and it smelled like diphtheria. It is February of 1888, and you can feel the cold before you even open your eyes. The stove went out sometime after midnight. The temperature inside the house is close to what the temperature outside should be. Rose is asleep in her small bed, buried under blankets, her breath making little clouds in the frozen air. Almanzo is already coughing. He has been coughing for 3 days. Diphtheria had been moving through the Dakota settlements for weeks. It moved the way disease always moves on the frontier, quietly at first, person to person, door to door, carried by hands that touched the wrong surface at the wrong moment. The bacterium that caused it, Corynebacterium diphtheria, was invisible and efficient and absolutely merciless. It attacked the throat and the airways. It built a thick grey membrane across the back of the throat that could suffocate a child in hours and a strong man in days. And in its most severe form, it sent toxins through the bloodstream that attacked the nerves, not just in the throat, not just in the lungs, but in the legs, in the hands, in everything. By February of 1888, both Laura and Almanzo had it. Laura's case was relatively mild. She recovered within weeks, shaken and exhausted but essentially intact. She would be sick, she would be weak, but she would stand up again. She would work again. The disease passed through her and left her standing. It did not leave Almanzo standing. His case was severe. The toxins from the diphtheria bacteria attacked his peripheral nervous system, what doctors today call diphtheritic polyneuropathy, what doctors in 1888 called a stroke of paralysis, because they did not yet have language precise enough for what they were watching happen. His legs went weak, then weaker. He lost the ability to walk without support. The man who had driven through blizzards, who had ploughed fields with teams of Morgan horses, who had been known across the county for his physical strength, that man found himself unable to button his own shirt some mornings. He was 31 years old. The doctors told him to rest, to wait, to be patient. His body, they said, needed time to heal. So Almanzo rested. He waited. He was patient. And then, because he was Almanzo Wilder and patience was not something that came to him naturally, he got up too soon. He went back to the fields before his nerves had healed. He climbed back onto the plough before his legs were ready. And the damage that had been trying to repair itself stopped repairing and calcified into something permanent. Something that would follow him for the next 61 years of his life. Every step, every morning, a limp and a cane and a body that never fully came back to him. Laura watched this happen. She stood in their small house, and she watched her husband go from a strong man to a man who needed help standing up. And she did not write about what that felt like. Not in her books, not in her journals, not in any letter that has ever been found. What she did instead was put on her boots and go out to the fields herself. She was 21 years old. She ploughed, she planted, she harvested. She did the work of a man while caring for a toddler and tending to an invalid husband and managing a household on next to nothing. She did it without complaining, at least not in any record that survived. She did it with the particular quiet fury of a woman who has run out of other options. And every evening she came back inside, took off her boots and sat by the lamp and waited for next year to be better. Next year was not better. You are sitting in the dark and you have just buried your son. His name was never recorded. That detail, that he had no name, or if he did, it did not survive, is itself a kind of grief, the kind that comes after grief, the secondary wound of being forgotten. He was born on July 11th, 1889, and he was, by all accounts, a large and healthy-looking boy. 10 pounds, according to the Smet leader. Laura and Almanzo had 4 years of losses behind them, and maybe this felt like something different. Maybe this felt like the tide turning. He died on August 7th, 1889. Laura wrote years later that he was taken with spasms and died so quickly that the doctor was too late. He was 27 days old. He's buried in the Smet Cemetery in South Dakota, his small grave marker reading simply, baby son of A.J. Wilder. Not even a first name, just baby son, as if the frontier couldn't spare the ink. Grace Ingalls, Laura's younger sister, wrote in her diary on August 27th, Laura's little baby boy, only a month old, died a little while ago. He looked just like Manly. Laura did not write about this in her books. She did not mention him in the Little House series at all. The child existed, breathed, looked up at his mother, and then was gone. And in the books, it is as if he was never there, as if the Prairie simply skipped that summer. It did not skip it, because within days of the baby's death, within days, while Laura was still in the numb white silence of fresh grief, the house caught fire. Prairie fires were not uncommon. A spark, a dry wind, a stretch of grass that hadn't seen rain in weeks. It could start a quarter-mile away and reach your door before you'd had time to gather rose and get outside. The Wilder home on the tree claim burned. Everything in it burned. 4 years of a life, furniture, clothing, the small accumulations of a household trying to build itself, gone in an afternoon. They moved into a 2-room shanty. They had nothing. Almanzo walked with a limp and could not do the heavy work. Laura had just buried her son. Rose was 2 years old and had watched her house disappear. The crops that year were thin. The debt was deep. And it was this. All of this together. Stacked one disaster on top of another like the Prairie itself was trying to make a point. That finally brought Laura Ingalls Wilder to the moment she spent 60 years trying not to think about. The moment she admitted they could not survive another Dakota winter alone. Almanzo's parents had visited at Christmas of 1889. James and Angeline Wilder, prosperous, settled, comfortable people in Spring Valley, Minnesota, had seen the situation. They had seen Almanzo's limp, seen the shanty, seen Laura's face, which by that point was a document of everything she refused to say out loud. They urged their son and his family to come to Spring Valley in the spring, to rest, to recover, to breathe. In the spring of 1890, Almanzo sold the sheep, the ones Laura had bought with her own teaching wages, and used the money for travel. And in May of 1890, they loaded what was left of their possessions into a covered wagon. Rose sat in the back. Almanzo held the reins with hands that ached on cold mornings. Laura sat beside him and looked straight ahead at the road. They were leaving. Not west, not forward. Back. Back toward family. Back toward shelter. Back toward the admission that the dream had failed. The books would later call this the first 4 years. They would describe it as a challenge faced with resilience. They would not describe what Laura's face looked like on that wagon seat, watching Smet disappear behind her. But she remembered. She always remembered. You have been travelling for days, and your body knows it. The covered wagon that carried you out of Smet was not fast. It was not comfortable. It moved across the Dakota and Minnesota landscape at the pace of the horses in front of it, patient, relentless, indifferent to your exhaustion. Rose has been sleeping in fits in the back, waking up to ask questions you don't quite have the heart to answer. Almanzo drives with both hands on the reins, his jaw set, not talking much. There is not much to say. You arrive in Spring Valley, Fillmore County, Minnesota, sometime in May of 1890. Spring Valley is not the frontier. That is the first thing you notice, and it hits you with a feeling you cannot quite name, somewhere between relief and shame and something else entirely. The land here is different. Southeastern Minnesota is rolling and green and wooded in a way that Dakota never is, never could be. The sky does not feel so enormous here. The trees break it up. The hills softened it. There is shade. There are buildings that look like they have been standing for years and plan to stand for many more. The Wilder farm sits on the northwest corner of town, more than 90 acres of established land that James Wilder had begun acquiring back in 1870 when he visited his wife's brother, George Day, who had been one of Spring Valley's early settlers. James had bought the adjoining land. Then, after George Day died in 1873, he purchased Day's property for $500. By the time James and Angeline moved the whole family from Malone, New York to Spring Valley in September of 1875, they had over 90 acres in 3 parcels, an established barn that still stands today on private property, a substantial farmhouse, outbuildings, livestock, fields in rotation, and the kind of agricultural operation that takes generations to build. James Wilder is 77 years old when you arrive. Angeline is 67. They're not young people, but they are not broken people. They are the kind of people who built something and kept it, which is a different thing entirely from the kind of people who kept trying to build something and kept watching it fall. You know which kind you are. And standing in front of that prosperous farm, with its established barn and its comfortable house, and its fields that are in order, after 4 years of failed harvests and a burned house, and a husband who walks with a cane, you feel the gap between what the Wilder family is and what you and Almanzo have become so acutely that it is almost a physical sensation. You are 23 years old. You have $150 to your name. You're alive. You're standing upright. And you are utterly, completely, undeniably dependent on the charity of your in-laws. Welcome to Spring Valley. The welcome itself is warm in the practical way of people who do not overstate things. James and Angeline greet you at the farm. There is food on the table. There is a room with a real bed, not a pallet on a shanty floor. Rose is swept up by her grandmother's arms, which is the first time in a very long time that someone has held her, without also carrying some portion of grief. Almanzo sets down his cane against the wall and sits carefully into a chair. Laura looks around the kitchen and does not say a word. But she is watching everything. She is cataloguing it all. The order of the shelves, the weight of the silence, the particular way Angeline moves through her own kitchen, with the confidence of a woman who has never had to wonder if she could afford to stay in it. Laura has always paid attention. She has always been the one in any room who is watching, measuring, filing everything away for later. She is filing all of this away. She will not write it down for decades, and when she does, she will leave it out. You're 23 years old, and you are learning what it feels like to have nothing to offer. This is not a lesson you expected. You grew up the daughter of a restless man, yes, but you grew up proud. You worked. You taught school when your family needed money. You married with your eyes open, and your vows trimmed of the word obey, because you intended to be equal in your own household. You ploughed fields with a man's tools while your husband could not stand up. You're not a woman who has ever thought of herself as helpless, and yet, helpless is what the arithmetic says. $150. That is the total sum of everything you and Almanzo possess in the world. For context, James Wilder's farm in Spring Valley was valued at $4,000 in the 1870 census, and that was before 2 decades of further development. The Wilder family's youngest son, Pearlie Day Wilder, 21 years old and living at home, has more economic footing than you do right now, and Pearlie has never ploughed a field while grieving. Almanzo sits at his father's table and eats his father's food and looks out at his father's fields, and he does not say what he is thinking. You know him well enough to know what that costs him. The man who was written about in your books, the Almanzo farmer boy, the boy who raised prize pumpkins and drove fast horses and impressed everyone with his competence. That Almanzo grew up in this house, this prosperous, orderly, successful house, and now here he is, 33 years old, back in that same house, eating at that same table, wearing a cane on his arm because a bacterial infection destroyed his nerves 2 years ago and never let go. Disabled masculinity in the 1890s was not a concept that anyone named, but it was a reality that every disabled man felt in his body and in his silence. A farmer who cannot farm is not just a man with a limitation. He is a man whose entire identity has been amputated. Everything Almanzo had built his sense of himself around, physical strength, horse mastery, the ability to provide, the capacity to work harder than anyone around him, all of that had been remade into something smaller, something that required assistance, something that walked with a limp and needed his father's charity. He sat in that chair and he bore it. You sat across from him and watched him bear it. And Rose played on the floor and knew none of this, the way 3-year-olds blessedly know none of the things happening above them. The Wilder family's Methodist faith was a significant presence in Spring Valley. The Spring Valley Methodist Episcopal Church had been built in 1876, the same year the Wilders arrived in town, and James Mason Wilder had contributed $50 toward its construction, one of the largest individual contributions recorded. That $50 gift established the Wilder family as prominent members of the congregation, people of standing, people whose names meant something in the community. The church still stands today at 221 West Cortlandt Street, a beautiful Victorian Gothic building with 21 stained glass windows intact, preserved as a museum. You and Almanzo attended that church during your time in Spring Valley. The church records document your attendance in 1890 and 1891, 2 lines in a ledger, the only documented evidence that you were ever there at all. You sat in the pews where Almanzo's family had sat for 15 years. You heard the same sermons that had accompanied the milestones of the Wilder family: baptisms, marriages, funerals, ordinary Sundays, extraordinary ones. You were surrounded by people who had known Almanzo as a boy, and who knew his father as a leading community member, who were watching you now with the particular polite curiosity of people who notice things but do not ask questions directly. You were the poor relations, you knew it, they knew it, and everyone was too well-mannered to say so out loud, which in some ways made it worse. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from work, but from vigilance. You know the kind. It is the exhaustion of being watched, of being measured, of existing in a space where you did not set the rules and cannot change them, where every small choice you make, how much you eat, how you speak to your husband, how much you ask for versus how much you silently take, carries the weight of judgment you cannot escape because it lives in the same house as you. This is what Laura's days in Spring Valley looked like. She helped with the domestic labour. She cooked and cleaned and sewed, which was expected. She cared for Rose, who was blooming in the security of a stable household after years of instability. She assisted with whatever the farm household needed, the rhythms of a prosperous agricultural family that ran on routine, on repetition, on the kind of order that comes from decades of practiced effort. Angeline Wilder was 67 years old and had been managing households since before Laura was born. Her kitchen operated exactly as she intended it to operate. Her house was exactly as she meant it to be. Laura stepped into that household and made herself as small as possible. That is not a criticism, it is a survival strategy. And Laura Ingalls Wilder had been practicing survival strategies her entire life. But it cost something. There is a scene she never wrote about, not exactly, but that you can construct from the surrounding evidence like a building whose walls are still up even though the roof is gone. It is winter 1890 to 1891. Minnesota winters are not as brutal as Dakota ones, but they are still cold, Still long, still the kind that keep people inside pressed against each other for months at a time. Laura is sewing. She was always sewing. It was the one thing her hands could do that required no conversation, no justification, no asking permission. Rose is playing on the floor nearby, 4 years old now, building something out of scraps of wood or whatever a child on a farm in 1890 could find to build with. And at some point, Rose asks about the baby, or she does not ask. She's too young to know there was a baby. Her parents never spoke of him. Rose would not learn about her unnamed brother until the 1950s. More than 60 years after his death, she discovered the existence of a sibling who had lived 27 days and been buried in the Smet cemetery. Her parents had kept that silence so complete, so total, that their own daughter never felt its shape until she was in her 70s. What does it take to hold a grief that large? What does it take to look at your only surviving child, playing happily on the floor of your in-laws' house, and say nothing about the small grave in Smet? About the baby who had looked, according to Grace Ingalls, just like Almanzo. Whatever it takes, Laura had it. She was built for endurance in the way that certain trees are built for wind, not by being rigid, but by bending so precisely and so silently that you could watch them in a storm and almost not realize how hard it was blowing. She bent. She endured. She filed everything away for later. And 60 years after that winter in Spring Valley, she would write books about her childhood that were beloved by millions, and in not a single one of them would you find the Spring Valley year, the lost baby, the husband's cane, the in-laws' kitchen, the shame of coming home defeated. The books would not contain any of this. But this is where the books came from. You need to understand something about James Wilder before you can understand what Spring Valley meant to Almanzo. James Mason Wilder was born in 1813 in Vermont. He moved to New York, purchased an 88-acre farm in Burke Township, Franklin County, substantial land for the era, married Angeline Day in 1843, and proceeded to build a farm operation so successful that by the 1870 census it was valued at $4,000. That is not a small number. That is generational wealth by frontier standards, the kind of capital that does not appear overnight, that requires decades of correct decisions, of neither recklessness nor timidity, of the steady accumulation that comes from staying in one place, long enough for roots to actually form. James raised 6 children on that farm. He kept a cash crop in hops production for the brewing industry. He was organized. He was a member of the Methodist Church. He paid his debts. He did not move 17 times in 30 years. When the hops crop failed in the late 1860s, James did not panic. He visited his wife's brother in Spring Valley, liked what he saw, bought land methodically over the next several years, and in September of 1875 moved the entire family from New York to Minnesota, not as an act of desperation, but as a planned agricultural transition. He arrived in Spring Valley with capital, with family connections through Angeline's relatives, the Days, with a plan. He was everything his son Almanzo, through no particular fault of his own, had failed to become. Almanzo had left New York for Dakota Territory in 1879, young and ambitious, and full of the particular conviction of someone who believes the next horizon holds what the current one does not. He claimed his homestead. He claimed his tree claim. He drove through blizzards. He worked his body harder than most men half his age. And then a microscopic bacterium arrived in the winter of 1888, and everything Almanzo had built his identity on became a thing he could no longer do. By the time he arrived at his father's farm in May of 1890, Almanzo was 33 years old and living in the shadow of a man who had managed to build and keep exactly the kind of farm that Almanzo had spent a decade trying and failing to establish. Every morning at breakfast, the contrast was right there at the table. James Wilder, 77 years old and still in command of a productive 90-acre operation. Almanzo Wilder, 33, walking with a cane, bringing nothing but his family and their debts. James did not rub this in. There is no documented evidence that he said anything unkind to his son. He was a Methodist, a church-going man, a family patriarch of the old school who understood that providing for struggling children was a duty, not a favour. He opened his home. He fed his son's family. He asked for nothing in return except perhaps the light farm work that Almanzo's limited physical capacity could manage. But you do not need someone to say a hard thing out loud for you to feel it. Almanzo felt it every morning when he put his hand on his cane, every afternoon when his father kept working fields that Almanzo could no longer handle, every evening when he sat at the table that his father had bought, in the house his father had built, eating food his father's farm had produced. He was 33 years old and he had never felt so much like a child. Now let's talk about Angeline. Angeline Day Wilder was 67 years old in 1890. Yeah, and she'd spent the previous 47 years of her life being competent in ways that most women of the era were never acknowledged for being. She was the daughter of George Day, one of Spring Valley's early settlers, which meant she had roots in the community that went back to before the town was properly a town. She knew the church, the neighbours, the rhythms of the land. She had raised 6 children and watched them scatter in different directions. Royal to Dakota, Eliza Jane to teaching, Alice to marriage, Almanzo to the homestead that became the disaster, Pearlie still at home. She was the kind of woman who ran a household the way a general runs a campaign, quietly, efficiently, with absolute command and no wasted motion. And now Laura Ingalls Wilder, 23 years old and arriving with nothing, was living in her house. The relationship between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law is always complicated. It is 2 women in the same domestic space, each with ideas about how that space should function, and only one of them with the authority that comes from ownership. In 1890, in a household where Angeline had spent 15 years establishing her routines, where her kitchen operated exactly as she intended, and her household ran according to her schedule, the arrival of a young daughter-in-law, especially one who had already demonstrated she knew how to run her own household, would have required negotiation. We do not know how that negotiation went. The letters, if there were any, have not survived. Laura never wrote about Angeline directly in terms of the Spring Valley year. What we know is that Laura was a strong-willed, intelligent, mere observant woman who had grown up in households where she watched adults navigate difficult dynamics in silence. She would have known how to make herself useful without overstepping. She would have known how to be present without being a problem. But it would have cost her something. Everything in those months cost her something. There was also Eliza Jane to consider. Almanzo's older sister had been Laura's schoolteacher back in Smet, and their relationship had not been warm. Laura would later depict Eliza Jane in Little Town on the Prairie as an incompetent, irritating teacher, a portrait so recognisably unflattering that readers who knew the family could identify the subject immediately. The real Eliza Jane was a woman who had made a life for herself through teaching in an era when women's professional options were narrow. And the relationship between her and Laura was one of sustained, quiet friction. Whether Eliza Jane was regularly present in Spring Valley during the 1890 to 1891 period is not definitively documented. But the prospect of her presence, the woman who had once been Laura's teacher, who knew exactly how far the Wilders had fallen, who would be witnessing their dependency firsthand, adds another layer to the particular difficulty of that year. Laura navigated all of it, quietly, without complaint, without apparently writing down a single word of how it felt. Here is something the Little House books never told you. The frontier mythology that Laura built her career on, the mythology of individual grit, of families who made it through sheer force of will and hard work and faith, that mythology was, in her own life, directly contradicted by the year she spent in Spring Valley, because the Wilder farm in Spring Valley was not just a farm, it was a safety net, a significant, well-capitalized, multi-generational safety net that caught Laura and Almanzo at the exact moment they would have otherwise hit the ground. Think about what that farm provided. Housing, which, at their financial level, they could not have afforded elsewhere. Food, produced on the farm itself, costing the family nothing beyond what it already cost to operate. Reduced physical demands on Almanzo, whose disability prevented him from performing the heavy farm labour that was the primary means of income for families in their situation. A stable environment for Rose during a critical developmental period when stability was the one thing her parents could not manufacture on their own. Proximity to a community, to a church, to a social network that could provide the informal supports, the borrowed tools, the shared labour, the neighbourly assistance that made frontier survival possible. The Wilders survived the catastrophes of 1885 to 1890, not because they were exceptional. They were actually quite ordinary in their misfortune. Historians estimate that between 40 and 60% of homesteaders in Dakota Territory abandoned their claims during the agricultural crises of the late 1880s. The Wilders were not unusual in their failure. What made them unusual was that they had somewhere to go when they failed. James Wilder's 90-acre farm, built on land he had purchased methodically, improved carefully, and maintained over 2 decades, was the infrastructure that made everything else possible. Without it, the story of Laura Ingalls Wilder does not have the second act it has. It does not have Rocky Ridge Farm in Missouri. It does not have the Little House books. It does not have the beloved American author who became one of the most read writers of the 20th century. It has a young woman and a disabled man and a small child and $150 trying to survive another Dakota winter with no shelter and no food and no backup plan. The safety net was made of family money, of generational wealth, of the kind of prosperity that does not announce itself but that turns out in crisis to be the only thing standing between survival and collapse. Laura knew this. She felt it every day of that year in Spring Valley, and she never wrote about it, not because it was not true, but because the story America wanted, the story that would sell books, the story that would be beloved, the story that would outlast her, was not a story about family safety nets and generational wealth and the infrastructure of frontier survival. It was a story about individual grit. So she gave them that story and buried this one. There is a particular rhythm to life on a working farm in southeastern Minnesota in 1890, and once you settle into it, it does not ask you for much beyond your body and your time. The mornings begin early, before light on some days, when the animals need feeding and the stove needs stoking and the household needs to be moving before the day gets away from it. Laura would have been up early. She was always up early. It was one of the things her childhood had built into her so deeply that it became constitution rather than habit. She would have helped in the kitchen, cooked, cleaned, done the sewing that households like this always had in surplus because fabric wore out and needed mending, and there was never quite enough of it, and someone always needed a pair of pants or a new dress for Sunday. Rose was 3, turning 4 during those first months in Spring Valley. She was at the age where everything is a discovery, where a barnyard full of animals is a paradise, and a grandmother's kitchen is a wonderland. Angeline Wilder, whatever complications existed in her relationship with Laura, was still Rose's grandmother, and grandmothers in 1890 were not the peripheral figures they sometimes are today. They were essential parts of the household, certainly involved in the daily work of childcare in a way that gave young parents breathing room. For the first time in years, Laura had breathing room. She did not know what to do with it. She had been working at maximum capacity for so long that stillness felt wrong, like an engine that cannot slow down without something rattling loose. She had been carrying the weight of 2 people's physical labour on top of her own grief, on top of her husband's disability, on top of their financial collapse, and now, in this calm and ordered farmhouse with regular meals and a full woodpile, and someone else's routines to follow, she had what? Time. Rest. The absence of emergency. She used it mostly for the things that needed doing. She sewed, she cooked, she cared for Rose, she attended church on Sundays, and she helped where she could and stayed out of the way where that was wiser. What she did not do, as far as we know, is write anything down. No letters from the Spring Valley year have been found, no diary entries, no notes. The silence in the historical record for this period is nearly perfect, which is itself a kind of evidence. A woman who would later become one of America's most prolific writers went an entire year without leaving a single written document of her inner life. Some historians call this a gap in the archive. Laura Ingalls Wilder, who understood narrative better than almost anyone, would have called it a choice. Every Sunday, you put on your best clothes, which are not very good, but they are clean and mended, and you walk with Almanzo to the Spring Valley Methodist Episcopal Church. The church is beautiful. There is no other word for it. In a small Minnesota town in 1890, the building is an anchor of the community in the way that important buildings become anchors. Not just architecturally, but spiritually, in the sense that the community has agreed that this place matters and has put resources into making it look like it matters. Victorian Gothic architecture. 21 stained glass windows that throw coloured light across the wooden pews on Sunday mornings. A congregation of people who have known each other for years, who have buried each other's children and celebrated each other's marriages, and prayed in the same building through good harvests and bad ones. James Wilder helped build this church. His $50 contribution in 1876 was one of the largest given. When he walks through the doors of this building on Sunday mornings, people know who he is. They know his history. They know his farm. They know that he's a man of standing in this community. When you walk through those same doors, beside a husband with a cane, you're something else entirely. You are the daughter-in-law who came back from Dakota with nothing. You are the young woman who, through whatever combination of bad luck and failed harvests and disease, has wound up dependent on a man who is now 77 years old, and whose generosity is the only thing standing between her family and the open sky. The congregation is polite. Minnesota Methodists in 1890 are practiced in polite. They greet you, they shake hands, they ask after Almanzo's health, with the careful concern of people who have already worked out among themselves what the situation is. They include you in the after-service conversation, in the small gatherings, in the social fabric of a community that takes its duty of fellowship seriously. But you are not a peer here. You're not a settler family making your way alongside neighbours who are all in the same precarious boat. In Smet, you had been a pioneer wife like dozens of others, all of you equally young and equally uncertain and equally defiant in the face of a land that did not particularly want you to succeed. Here, you're the poor relation of one of the founding families. The distinction is felt in ways you cannot put into words, in the way conversations pause when you approach, in the way people ask after your parents, Charles and Caroline Ingalls, who have their own struggles and cannot rescue you from this one, with the particular courtesy of people who already know the answer and want to be kind about it. You sit in the pew, you pray, you sing the hymns that have been in your life since childhood, because Charles Ingalls raised his daughters in churches and campfire services, and the kind of American Protestant faith that made music out of difficulty. The singing, at least, cost nothing. The singing, at least, is entirely yours. You need to understand what recovery from diphtheritic polyneuropathy actually looked like in 1890, because it was not the kind of recovery that gets celebrated. It was not dramatic. There was no moment when Almanzo set down his cane and walked across the yard unassisted and Laura wept with relief. That moment did not happen. What happened was slower and less satisfying and more permanent than any narrative of triumphant recovery would suggest. His legs improved slightly. The chronic weakness that had gripped them in the aftermath of the 1888 illness eased somewhat over time, particularly with reduced physical demands, which the Spring Valley year provided for the first time in abundance. He could do light work. He could move around the farm, check on the animals, participate in the less physically demanding tasks of agricultural life. His stamina was limited. His strength was a fraction of what it had been. The cane did not go away. It would not go away for the rest of his life. Almanzo Wilder, who lived to be 92 years old and died in 1949, walked with a limp and used support for walking for 61 years after his diphtheria complications. That is a long time to carry a reminder of what you used to be able to do. In Spring Valley, the reduced demands of dependent household living gave his body time to find its new normal. He did what he could around the farm, the animal care, the equipment maintenance, the planning and observation that do not require a fully functional body, but do require the knowledge and attention of someone who has been farming his entire life. He watched his father work the fields and offered what input he could. He spent time in the barn with the horses, which had always been his primary domain, and which remained something he could do despite the limp. The horses were important. Almanzo's relationship with Morgan horses had been a defining part of his identity since childhood. The farmer boy that Laura would later write about was a boy defined, or above almost everything else, by his way with animals. In the Spring Valley barn with James Wilder's horses and livestock, Almanzo could still be competent, could still be the man who knew more about a horse than the horse knew about itself, could still be someone whose opinion mattered and whose skill was visible. It was not everything, but it was something. And in 1890, after 5 years of watching everything fall apart, something was enough to keep you breathing. The relationship between Almanzo and his father during this period is not documented in any surviving source. We do not know what they said to each other, or if they said much at all. Men of that generation and that culture often communicated through shared labour rather than conversation, and with Almanzo's labour capacity severely reduced, the nature of that communication must have changed. What we can infer is that James Wilder provided the refuge without condition, and without, as far as any record shows, making his son feel worse about needing it than the situation already required. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, a kind of love that does not announce itself, but that makes the difference between a man who can rebuild himself and a man who cannot. Every author makes choices. That is not a revelation. But when the author is also the subject, when the memoir and the mythology are the same document, the choices become something more than editorial decisions. They become the architecture of how a person will be remembered. Laura Ingalls Wilder began writing what would become the Little House series in 1930, when she was 63 years old. But she was living at Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri, which she and Almanzo had purchased in 1894, a 40-acre farm outside a small Ozarks town that they had developed over the next 4 decades into a prosperous and beloved home. She was financially stable, finally, for the first time in her adult life. She was old enough to look back at her childhood with the particular clarity that comes from distance, and she began to write. The book she produced between 1932 and 1943 covered her life from early childhood in Wisconsin, through her marriage to Almanzo. They were children's books, intended for young readers, and they became among the most beloved American children's novels ever published. They made Laura famous. They made the frontier feel accessible and warm. They made Pa a hero and Ma a saint and the prairie an adventure. They left out enormous amounts of the truth. The Spring Valley year was not the only omission. Laura also left out the infant son who died at 27 days. She left out most of the real scale of the family's debts and failures. She left out the racism that ran through her family's history with the Osage and Lakota people. She left out the years she worked as a dressmaker to support the family while Almanzo took odd jobs. She constructed, deliberately and skillfully, a narrative of pioneer resilience that was inspirational in proportion to how much it simplified. But the Spring Valley year is a particular kind of silence, because it is not just a difficult story omitted for the sake of a more pleasant one. It is the story of everything the Little House mythology most directly contradicts. Dependency, failure, family charity, disability, a marriage strained to its limits, and the fundamental truth that individual grit was not, in Laura and Almanzo's case, enough. The Little House books are, at their heart, a case for the idea that hard work and faith and love can carry a family through anything. They are a monument to the idea that the pioneer spirit, that distinctly American combination of stubbornness and optimism, is sufficient to the challenges of the frontier. The Spring Valley year proves that it is not, and Laura knew that. She knew it the entire time she was sitting in Spring Valley, eating food she had not grown, sleeping under a roof she had not built, attending church in a community whose respect she had to borrow from a father-in-law she could not hope to impress. As she felt the gap between the myth she would eventually construct and the reality she was living in her bones, every morning, every Sunday, every quiet evening in Angeline Wilder's kitchen. And she chose the myth, deliberately, strategically, with full awareness of what she was doing, because she understood something that we sometimes forget. A myth is not a lie. It is a story that carries a truth that the literal facts cannot always hold. The truth that Laura's myth carried, that ordinary people can endure extraordinary difficulty and still build something worth having, was real, even if the specific shape of how that endurance worked was not what the book suggested. She just decided to tell the version that people needed to hear. There is a detail in this story that should stop you cold. Rose Wilder Lane, Laura's daughter, the woman who would become a successful author in her own right, and who would substantially shape the Little House books through her editorial work, did not know her dead brother existed until the 1950s. Think about that for a moment. Rose was born in 1886. She was 3 years old when her baby brother died. She was in Spring Valley when Laura and Almanzo were processing that grief, in whatever way they were processing it. Silently, it seems. Always silently. She grew up. She went to school. She became a journalist, a traveller, a novelist. She collaborated with her mother on the Little House books over the course of a decade. She spent more time with Laura than almost anyone, in correspondence if not in person. And her parents never told her about the baby. Not once. Not in a conversation. Not in a letter. Or not in the drafts of the first 4 years, which Laura wrote in the early 1940s, and which covered the years of her marriage up to and including the fire and the infant death. Though even there, the baby story is present mostly in what surrounds it, in the weight of what is not quite said. Rose discovered the existence of her unnamed brother in the 1950s, according to the letters preserved at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library, where both Laura's and Rose's papers are archived. She was in her 60s when she learned that there had been another child, that her parents had buried a son, that she'd almost had a brother who looked, according to Aunt Grace, just like their father. 60 years of silence. Complete, total, impenetrable. What does that silence tell us? It tells us that the grief Laura carried from August of 1889 was of a kind that she had decided, at some fundamental level, would not be shared. Not with her daughter, not with her readers, not with posterity. The unnamed baby boy would lie in the Smet cemetery, his grave marker reading baby son of A.J. Wilder, next to Laura's mother Carolyn's grave, and the world would simply not know he was there. And the Spring Valley year, the year Laura and Almanzo spent recovering from that death, among other devastations, would simply not exist in the official record of her life, because if you acknowledge Spring Valley, you have to acknowledge what drove them there. And if you acknowledge what drove them there, you have to acknowledge the baby. And if you acknowledge the baby, you're no longer telling the story of plucky pioneer resilience. You're telling the story of a woman who walked into a prosperous farm in 1890, carrying grief so profound she buried it for 60 years. That story is true. That story is real. That story is, in some ways, more remarkable than anything in the Little House books. But it is not the story that sold books in 1932. Historians have a term for this kind of deliberate omission in literature and memoir: a productive silence. The idea is that what an author leaves out can tell us as much about the historical moment, about the pressures, the expectations, the what one could and could not say as what the author includes. Laura's silence about Spring Valley is one of the most instructive, productive silences in American literary history, precisely because the shape of the silence is so clearly defined by the mythology she chose to construct in its place. Pamela Smith Hill, in her literary biography, Laura Ingalls Wilder, A Writer's Life, analyses Laura's authorial choices as deliberate constructions rather than innocent recollections. She argues that what Laura omitted is as revealing as what she published, that the gaps in the Little House narrative are windows into the parts of the frontier experience that could not be made to serve the story Laura needed to tell. Caroline Fraser, whose 2017 biography, Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls. Wilder won the Pulitzer Prize nomination and is considered the most comprehensive critical biography of Laura to date, goes further. She traces the full arc of Laura and Almanzo's marriage with the kind of archival rigour that reveals how systematically the Spring Valley period and its surrounding disasters were managed out of the public narrative. Fraser documents not just what happened, but why the omissions made commercial sense, literary sense, and psychological sense for a woman who had survived enormous difficulty and found in myth-making the means to make peace with it. The scholarly consensus, built over decades of work by biographers including John E. Miller, William Anderson, and Nancy Tistad-Kupal, whose annotated edition of Pioneer Girl, Laura's unpublished adult memoir, was published in 2014, is that the Spring Valley period represents a deliberate omission born of its direct contradiction of the self-sufficient pioneer narrative. Laura could not write about Spring Valley without writing about failure, dependency, disability, and the safety net of family wealth that made everything else possible. and those truths were incompatible with the story she was constructing. She chose the story, and she chose it with full authorial intelligence. What Laura understood, and what the Spring Valley year ultimately reveals about her, is that she was not just a woman who survived the frontier. She was a woman who understood narrative. She understood what stories do to people, what they carry, what purposes they serve, and she understood that the story of a family that made it through catastrophe with their faith and love intact was worth more to a Depression-era readership, to a country that needed desperately to believe that hard work and perseverance could carry a person through the worst, than the true story of a family that barely survived because a grandfather's farm was large enough to absorb them. She gave people what they needed, and she was right that they needed it. But we also need the other story, the true one, the one where the safety net exists, the one where survival is structural as well as personal, the one where the courage is real but so is the help. We need Spring Valley. By the spring of 1891, something had shifted. The Wilders had spent approximately a year in Spring Valley. Almanzo's health had stabilized into its permanent configuration, not recovered, not restored, but managed. He could move, work within limits, care for the animals, contribute to the household in ways proportionate to what his body would allow. Laura had rested, had processed grief that could not be spoken, and still somehow needed to move through her, had watched Rose flourish in the stability of a prosperous farmhouse in a way that reminded her what a healthy childhood could look like. But Spring Valley was not theirs, and Laura Ingalls Wilder, who had grown up watching her father fail at everything except movement, who had married at 18 partly because she saw in Almanzo a man whose rootedness seemed like the antithesis of her own peripatetic childhood. Laura had not come to Spring Valley to stay. She had come to survive. And survival, once achieved, was not the same as living. The Wilder family farm was James and Angeline's farm. It would always be James and Angeline's farm. There was no path from dependency to independence in Spring Valley. No piece of land available for Almanzo to claim. No way for him to establish his own operations separate from his father's. No narrative in which the 33-year-old disabled son becomes a farmer in his own right in the shadow of the successful patriarch who represents everything he could not become. They needed to leave. They both knew it. The question was where to go. The medical thinking of the era held that warm climates could benefit people with chronic disabilities and weakened constitutions, the reasoning being that cold exacerbated inflammation and muscle weakness, while warm and humid air allowed the body to relax and heal. It was not entirely wrong, and not entirely right, in the way that much of 1890s medicine occupied the productive middle ground between knowledge and hope. For Almanzo, who walked with a cane in the Dakota winters, and whose legs ached on cold mornings, the prospect of a southern climate was not an unreasonable hope. Westville, Florida, in Holmes County in the Florida Panhandle, was selected. Why Westville specifically is not precisely documented. There may have been word from other families who had tried the region, or information obtained through church networks, or simply the logic of the southernmost destination they could realistically reach on their budget. In October of 1891, they left Spring Valley. The church attendance records that document their presence in 1890 and 1891 stop in October of that year. Their year in Minnesota ends in the same way it began, quietly, without fanfare, a footnote in the records of a congregation they never quite belonged to. James and Angeline were still at the farm. Pearlie was still there. The barn still stood. The fields were in their full rotation. The Spring Valley Methodist Church still gleamed at the end of West Cortlandt Street. Laura and Almanzo and Rose got on a train, heading south, and did not look back. Westville, Florida's was not what anyone hoped. The climate that had been supposed to ease Almanzo's disabilities turned out to be oppressive rather than restorative. The heat and humidity of the Florida Panhandle in the early 1890s were nothing like the dry, wide-sky heat of the Dakota Prairie. It was thick. It pressed against you. The mosquitoes were apocalyptic. The landscape was unfamiliar, dense subtropical growth, flat and swampy in ways that felt alien to people who had spent their lives on open plains and rolling Minnesota hills. Laura hated it. She did not write extensively about this period either. But what survives suggests she found Florida profoundly inhospitable. The climate did not agree with her. The landscape did not speak to her. The hoped-for improvement in Almanzo's condition did not materialize to the degree they had hoped. And whatever economic opportunity they had imagined finding in the Florida Panhandle did not present itself in any form adequate to their needs. They stayed approximately 1 year. In August of 1892, they returned to Smet, South Dakota. This is another of the movements that the books, even the first 4 years, which is the most frank of Laura's published works, do not quite capture in its full humiliation. To leave De Smet in 1890 because you cannot survive, to spend a year at your in-laws' farm, to spend another year in Florida chasing a climate cure, and then to return to the town where people know your story and where you left owing debts and dreams and more than you came back with. That is not a triumphant homecoming. But they came back, because De Smet was, despite everything, a place they knew, people they knew, a community that had watched them fail and had, in the particular generosity of small frontier towns, stored the watching and moved on. Laura found work immediately. She took in sewing. She cooked for others. She did the practical, skilled labour that her hands had been trained to do since childhood. Almanzo took what work his body would allow, odd jobs, lighter labour, the things a man with permanent leg weakness could manage without requiring more recovery than he could afford. They saved, carefully, methodically, the way Laura had always saved, which was to say with the kind of attention that comes from having run out of things before and not wanting to do it again. In 2 years of De Smet dressmaking, Laura saved $100. $100 toward a new start, toward a piece of land somewhere warmer than Dakota, somewhere the agricultural conditions might actually allow a farm to prosper, somewhere that was not someone else's place, and not a temporary shelter, but their own. Missouri, July 17th, 1894. Laura, Almanzo, and Rose climb into a 2-seated hack, a small, covered wagon, and leave De Smet for the last time. Laura takes a writing pad. She keeps a diary of the journey describing the landscape, the miles, the small towns they pass through, the wildflowers alongside the road, the way the sky changes as you move south and east from the Dakota Plains into the Midwest and toward the Ozarks. That diary would be published in 1962, 33 years after her death, as On the Way Home. It is one of the most direct documents of her actual voice we have, not shaped by Rose's editorial hand, not filtered through the requirements of children's literature, just Laura's observations as she moved through a landscape she was seeing for the first time. She arrives in Mansfield, Missouri on August 30th, 1894. On September 21st, 1894, Laura and Almanzo purchase a 40-acre farm outside Mansfield. The property included 400 seedling apple trees. It cost them the $100 Laura had saved in De Smet, plus some additional money. The accounts vary slightly on the precise figures, and it was one of the most consequential $100 ever spent in American literary history. The deed was dated September 21st, 1894, and it was registered in Laura's name. Not Almanzo's, Laura's. That is not an accident. It is not a formality. It is a woman who had spent the previous 9 years watching property slip away from a man whose name it was in. Burned house, failed claims, abandoned land, deciding with the quiet efficiency of someone who learns from experience that this time the deed would belong to her. The farm sat about 1.5 miles east of Mansfield in Wright County, Missouri. It was 40 acres of rocky, a heavily wooded Ozark hillside, not the flat, open prairie Laura had grown up on, nothing like the managed agricultural land of Spring Valley, nothing like anything she had yet called home. The land was difficult. The soil was thin over the limestone. The hill was steep in places. There was a small log house on a wooded rise, windowless at first, barely shelter, and a year-round spring in a nearby ravine that ran clear and cold even in August. And there were trees, approximately 800 apple trees planted in nursery rows, close-spaced rows where young trees could be watched and tended before being transplanted to permanent orchard positions, most of them not yet bearing fruit. They had been ordered from Stark Brothers Nursery in Louisiana, Missouri. and planted by the previous owner on land he ultimately sold before the orchard could mature. The variety was primarily Ben Davis apple, a hardy, thick-skinned variety that shipped well but tasted, as agricultural writers of the era tactfully described it, entirely reliable rather than particularly wonderful. 200 of the 800 trees had been set out in a proper orchard configuration the previous spring. The remaining 600 were still in their nursery rows, waiting for someone to finish the job. Laura and Almanzo looked at those trees, at 800 juvenile apple trees on 40 acres of rocky Missouri hillside, and they saw not what the land was, but what it could become. They named it Rocky Ridge Farm, and they began to build. Here is what 40 acres of a rocky Ozark hillside looked like in August of 1894, and here is what it asked of two people who had very little left to give. The log cabin needed work before it could be lived in through a Missouri winter. Almanzo, with his permanent limp and his limited but functional capacity for lighter construction work, began immediately. The cabin had no windows cut into it. He cut them. The roof needed repair. He repaired it. Laura and Rose moved in with the bare minimum of furniture. A bed, a stove, the few possessions they had transported across 1,000 miles of prairie in a two-seated hack. They had arrived in late August. The Missouri Ozarks in August are warm and humid and rich-smelling, nothing like Dakota. The air carried something different, green and dense and complicated with the smells of old forests and soil that has been working for centuries. After the hard, dry winds of the plains and the controlled agricultural order of Spring Valley, the Ozark landscape probably felt both welcoming and overwhelming in equal measure. The first priority was food. They had arrived with their wagon contents, their $100 spent on the farm and the immediate requirement of feeding 3 people through the coming fall and winter, on land that had not yet been developed to feed them. Laura did what she had always done. She made do. She kept chickens from the beginning. Even in the earliest days on Rocky Ridge, poultry was a part of the operation, because eggs were both nutritional necessity and potential income. She gardened, she preserved, she stretched whatever they had with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent a decade learning to make a little go a very long way. Almanzo worked on the cabin and on the orchard. The 800 apple trees needed to be moved from their nursery rows to proper orchard spacing. That work was not fast, and it was not easy, and it required a degree of physical labour that was at the outer edge of what Almanzo's condition permitted. But he did it, slowly, methodically, over years rather than one heroic season. Rose later remembered her father working among those apple trees in the early years of Rocky Ridge, with the particular patience of a man who has learned to work within limits rather than against them. The apple trees would not produce a significant harvest for years. That was the fundamental economic reality of Rocky Ridge. The orchard, which was the farm's primary commercial asset, required time. You planted, you tended, you waited. 7 years at minimum. You saw for a Ben Davis orchard to come into meaningful production. 7 years of needing income from other sources while the investment grew. Laura understood this, and she responded in the way she always responded to the gap between what the land would eventually give and what the family needed right now. She worked. She took in sewing from Mansfield neighbours, she sold eggs, she sold butter, she contributed to local newspapers. Small pieces at first, practical farm wife writing that would eventually evolve into a regular column for the Missouri Ruralist, and then, decades later, into something considerably more ambitious. But in 1894 and 1895 she was writing for eggs and butter money, which is to say she was doing what the wife of a disabled farmer on a developing Ozark hillside needed to do. Almanzo, for his part, had found something remarkable in the Ozarks that he had not found anywhere else since 1888. Useful work his body could do. The Missouri climate, milder than Dakota and drier than Florida, genuinely suited him better than either. He could manage the orchard work in pieces, taking breaks when his legs required it, returning to the trees when they did not. He could run the lighter farm operations. He could work with the stock. He was not what he had been before the diphtheria, but he was more than he had been in Smet in the final years, more than he had been in Spring Valley, more, certainly, than he had been in the Florida Panhandle. His capacity expanded slowly to meet the requirements of a farm that, unlike a Dakota wheat claim, did not demand everything all at once in a short, brutal harvest season. Rocky Ridge worked with Almanzo, or Almanzo worked with Rocky Ridge. The distinction may not matter. What matters is that it worked. You need to understand the year the books were published to understand why the silence was a survival strategy and not merely a personal preference. The first Little House book, Little House in the Big Woods, was published in 1932. Laura was 65 years old. The year 1932 was the absolute nadir of the Great Depression in the United States. Unemployment was approaching 25%. Banks were failing by the hundreds. Families who had built lives over decades were watching them unmade in months. The national mood was not despair exactly. Americans are not, by temperament, a despairing people. But it was something close to it, a profound uncertainty about whether the things you built and the lives you made could be trusted to hold. Into that moment, an elderly woman in Missouri offered the American reading public a story about a family that moved through hardship with their love and faith intact. A family that faced genuine difficulty, cold, hunger, danger, loss, and kept going, kept building, kept believing that the work of their hands had meaning. A story where the frontier was hard but knowable, where the land could be mastered if you were willing to master yourself first. The books were not escapism in the dismissive sense. They were a kind of oxygen. They told a Depression-era audience what it desperately needed to be told, that ordinary people had survived worse than this. Whores had built something from nothing before, had come through catastrophe with their families whole and their values intact. The Spring Valley year could not have been in those books, not because it was shameful, though Laura may have felt that it was, but because it undermined the entire structural premise of what the books were offering. The message of the Little House series is that the pioneer family was sufficient to its own survival. That hard work and love and faith and the particular American refusal to stay down could carry you through anything. The Spring Valley year says, sometimes they are not sufficient. Sometimes you need your in-laws' farm. Sometimes the disaster is too large for individual resilience to manage. Sometimes survival is structural, not personal. That message, true as it is, was not what 1932 needed to hear. So Laura gave 1932 what it needed. She gave it Pa's Fiddle and Ma's China and the Long Winter and the Silver Lake. She gave it a childhood made of music and hardship and love and the particular romance of the open plains. She gave it the myth. And the myth worked. It worked for decades. It worked so well that by the time scholars began pulling at its edges, began tracing the census records and the land claims and the unpublished manuscripts, the mythology had become so deeply embedded in the American self-image that disentangling the story from the truth required the work of an entire generation of historians. Laura knew what she was doing. She always knew what she was doing. "All I have told is true," she said, late in her life, in a line that became perhaps her most quoted statement. But it is not the whole truth. That admission, spare and precise and utterly characteristic of the woman who made it, is the whole story in a single sentence. The books are not lies, they are a selection, a curation. The truth, organised and shaped and illuminated from certain angles while other angles are kept in shadow. Spring Valley is one of the angles she kept in shadow. Now let us talk about Rose Wilder Lane. Because the story of what Laura omitted cannot be told honestly without accounting for the woman who helped her tell it. Rose was born in 1886 on the Dakota Tree claim. She was 3 years old when her brother died and 4 years old when she left Spring Valley. She grew up on Rocky Ridge Farm, watching her parents build something from nothing on 40 acres of rocky Missouri hillside. Yeah, she was an exceptionally bright and restless child who eventually left Mansfield to make her own way in the world. As a telegrapher, then a journalist, then a novelist, then one of the most widely read women writers in America in the 1920s and 1930s. By the time Laura began working on the Little House series in the early 1930s, Rose was an established professional writer. She had published novels. She had written for major magazines. She knew how stories were structured, how narratives were shaped, how a book that would be read by children needed to be paced and voiced and ordered. And when Laura sent her the first manuscripts, rough, handwritten on pencil tablets, the raw material of memory rather than the finished product of craft. Rose did not just edit them, she rebuilt them. Manuscript comparisons, conducted by scholars who have had access to both Laura's original drafts and the published texts, reveal that Rose's interventions went far beyond copy editing. She invented scenes, she constructed dialogue, she changed the chronology of events, she added descriptive passages that do not appear in Laura's originals. In some cases, the voice of the finished text is as much Rose's as Laura's, or more precisely is a product of two women's voices blended so thoroughly that later scholars have spent careers trying to separate them. The most controversial question in Little House scholarship is not whether Rose contributed substantially. That is now beyond scholarly dispute. The question is whether the scale of her contribution constitutes co-authorship, whether the book should be attributed to Laura Ingalls Wilder and Rose Wilder Lane, rather than to Laura alone. Rose herself, during her lifetime, vigorously denied any authorial credit. She called herself an editor. She insisted that the books were her mother's work, shaped by her guidance rather than created by her hand. She maintained this position until her death in 1968. Some scholars take Rose at her word. Others argue that her denials were motivated by the fact that, at the height of her career, she considered children's book authorship beneath her professional standing, that she had no interest in being associated publicly with what she privately considered a lesser genre. Johnny Miller, one of the leading authorities on both women, takes a nuanced position. The books represented genuine collaboration, with Laura's memories and voice as the essential foundation, and Rose's narrative skills as the essential structure. What is not in dispute is that the collaboration was real, was deep, and produced something neither woman could have produced alone. And what is also not in dispute is that neither woman, in all those years of working together, chose to include the Spring Valley year. That silence was joint. It belonged to both of them, to Laura, who had lived it and chosen not to write it, and to Rose, who knew enough of it to understand, with her professional writer's instinct, that it did not fit the story they were constructing. They were building a monument, and monuments do not include the years when the builders needed someone else's help to survive. Here is what we have been building toward, across all these hours and all these chapters, and all these miles of prairie and Minnesota farmland and Ozark hillside. Laura Ingalls Wilder's Spring Valley year, the year she spent at her in-laws' farm in southeastern Minnesota, recovering from a dead baby in a burned house and 4 years of failure, caring for a husband with a permanent disability, saving her family on borrowed time and borrowed shelter, is not a footnote. It is not a gap in the archive. It is not an uneventful interlude that slipped through the net of historical documentation, because nothing particularly interesting happened. It is the hinge. It is the year that made everything else possible. Without Spring Valley, there is no Rocky Ridge Farm. Without Rocky Ridge, there are no Little House books. Without the books, there is no Laura Ingalls Wilder as America knows her. No National Book Award, no ALA Award, no beloved television series, no generations of children who learned to love reading through the story of a little girl on the prairie who kept going. The year she spent depending on her in-laws' charity, sitting in their kitchen and eating their food and accepting their shelter, that year is the foundation of the entire structure. The monument was built on top of it, and Laura spent the rest of her life making sure no one looked down. But we should look down. Not to diminish what she built. The books are genuinely extraordinary, genuinely beloved, genuinely valuable. But because looking at the foundation tells us something important about how the building was actually constructed. It tells us that the frontier mythology of pure individual self-reliance, the mythology that Laura's books helped to create, and that has become one of the most powerful narratives in American culture, is a beautiful story that is not the whole truth. The whole truth is that survival on the American frontier was a collective enterprise. Families helped each other. Communities absorbed failures. Safety nets made of human connection, and family wealth and community solidarity caught the people that individual grit could not hold up. The Wilders survived not because they were exceptional, but because they had people who could catch them when they fell. That is not a diminishment of their courage. It is actually a more honest account of what courage costs and what makes it possible. Almanzo Wilder walked with a cane for 61 years after his diphtheria. He kept farming, kept working, kept building Rocky Ridge with his limited body and his considerable stubbornness for the rest of his life. He died in 1949 at 92, outliving Laura by 10 years, outliving almost everyone who knew him on the frontier. He never wrote about any of it. He left no memoirs. He made no claims. He just kept working year after year, in the orchard and the barn and the fields of a farm that had grown from 40 acres to nearly 200, that had produced the income and the stability that finally, in old age, gave him and Laura the kind of life they had always been trying to build. That is courage. That is resilience. And it was made possible in its most critical moment by an elderly man's 90-acre farm in Spring Valley, Minnesota, and by parents who opened their door to a disabled son and his struggling wife without making them feel worse than the situation already required. The Spring Valley Methodist Episcopal Church still stands at 221 West Cortlandt Street in Spring Valley, Minnesota. The Victorian Gothic building with its 21 stained glass windows has been preserved as a museum. The Wilder barn, the one that was standing when Laura and Almanzo arrived in May of 1890, still stands on private property, visible from the road, a piece of wood and stone that has outlasted almost everyone who ever walked through its door. If you go to Spring Valley today, you can walk into that church and sit in the pews where Laura and Almanzo sat every Sunday for more than a year. You can look at the stained glass and listen to whatever silence the building holds, which is the particular silence of places where a great deal of human feeling has passed through and left no record beyond the fact of its presence. And you can think about what it means to be a person who survives the worst and then decides, with full deliberate intention, to make the worst beautiful enough to share. That is what Laura did. Not by lying, not by inventing, but by choosing, as every storyteller chooses, which parts of the truth to hold up to the light and which parts to fold quietly into shadow, where they wait, patient as an apple tree in its nursery rose, for someone to come along and ask. We asked. And the answer was Spring Valley. It is late 1949. Almanzo Wilder has just died at Rocky Ridge Farm at the age of 92. After 63 years of marriage to a woman who refused the word obey in her vows and who ploughed his fields while he could not stand up, and who carried their grief in her body for 60 years without putting it into words. Laura is 82 years old. She's been famous for almost 2 decades. The Little House books are read in schools across the country. Children write her letters that pile up faster than she can answer them. She has won the ALA's award for Distinguished Service to Children's Literature, the very first recipient of an honour that bears her name. She is, by any measure, one of the most beloved American writers of the 20th century. She sits in the farmhouse on Rocky Ridge, the house that Almanzo built over years of careful labour, 10 rooms added slowly from 2, and constructed from Ozark timber with his limited but determined hands, and she is alone for the first time in her adult life. She does not write another book. She has already said in the books everything she chose to say. The Little House series ends with these happy golden years, published in 1943, which closes on Laura and Almanzo's marriage in 1885. On the morning after the wedding, Laura taking off her sunbonnet and looking out at the land that is theirs, the future bright and open and possible. The series ends before the diphtheria, before the dead baby, before the fire, before Spring Valley, before all of it. It ends on the threshold of everything that will happen and says, here is where the story closes. She knew what she was doing. The threshold is a beautiful place to end. Before the losses, before the failures, i.e. before the years of hard reckoning with the distance between the dream and the reality. The young woman on the threshold of her marriage, looking at the future. That Laura is the one who lives in the books, the one with everything still ahead of her, everything still possible, the whole long prairie of her life stretching out under a wide sky. The other Laura, the one who arrived in Spring Valley in May of 1890 with $150 and a grief she could not speak. That Laura lives here, in the facts the historians dug up, in the church records, in the grave marker into Smet that says baby son of a J. Wilder, in the documents at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library. In the barn that still stands on private property in southeastern Minnesota, its old wood holding the memory of a year that was never written down. Laura Ingalls. Wilder died on February 10th, 1957, at Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri. She was 90 years old. She had outlived nearly everyone who knew the full truth of her life. She had given the world the myth she chose to give it. The truth waited. It is patient, the truth. It has all the time that the myth is using. And tonight, after all these years, we have told it. There is a question underneath all of this that has been waiting since we first stepped off the train in Spring Valley. Why does it matter? Why does it matter that Laura omitted this year, that she buried the baby's name, that she shaped the myth instead of the reality? The books are still beautiful. The stories are still true in the ways that matter. Children still love them. Adults who grew up with them still carry them somewhere close to the center of their understanding of what it means to be American, to be a family, to survive. Why does it matter that the myth is not the whole truth? Here is why. Because the myth of pure self-sufficiency, the idea that the right individual with enough faith and hard work can survive anything without structural support, is not just a story about the past. It is a story that American culture has told itself over and over in politics and policy and the way we organize our social systems for 150 years. We have built welfare systems and destroyed them on the strength of that story. We have looked at people in crisis and asked why they did not simply work harder, maul with the particular cruelty of people who believe the myth and cannot see the safety net that caught them when they did not work hard enough. Laura Ingalls. Wilder's Spring Valley year is one of the places where the myth and the reality diverge most visibly. The most celebrated pioneer family in American literature survived not because of their grit alone, but because a 77-year-old man had spent decades building a farm large enough to absorb them. The self-sufficiency was real, and the safety net was also real. Both are true, and both truths are necessary to hold at the same time, because a world that pretends only one of them exists is a world that will fail the people who most need the other one. Laura knew this. It was one of the reasons, perhaps, that she chose the myth, not because she did not know the truth, but because she understood that the myth was doing necessary work for people who needed to believe that individual effort mattered. She was not wrong about that. But we need the whole truth too. We need the Spring Valley barn and the church records and the baby son who had no name and the cane that never went away. We need the year she never wrote. Let's walk the last mile together. There is a particular kind of person that history tends to flatten into two dimensions. The beloved ones, the celebrated ones, the ones whose names get put on schools and libraries and awards given to other writers. Time does this to people. It sands them down to their most presentable surfaces, removes the friction, rounds the sharp edges, until what remains is a figure rather than a human being. Warm, iconic, safe. Laura Ingalls Wilder has been that figure for a long time. She has been the sunbonnet girl, the pioneer sweetheart, the woman who taught generations of American children to love reading and love history, and love the particular romance of a life lived close to the land. Her face, strong-featured, direct-eyed, a face that never quite relaxed into the soft pleasantness expected of women of her era, has appeared on postage stamps. Her farm in Mansfield, Missouri draws visitors from every state in the country. Her books have never gone out of print. Her name has become, in the American cultural imagination, something close to a synonym for pioneer virtue itself, and all of that is earned. Let us be clear about that before we go any further. The books are genuinely extraordinary. Not extraordinary for their era, not extraordinary for children's literature, not extraordinary given the circumstances of their composition, simply extraordinary, full stop. They are written with a precision of sensory detail and an economy of emotional effect that most professional writers spend entire careers trying to achieve and never quite reach. The scene of the long winter, the blind fever that takes Mary's sight, the first glimpse of Silver Lake from the wagon. These are not just children's memories, they are literature. They earn the reverence they have received. But reverence, if it is the only thing we bring to a person's story, is actually a form of condescension. It says, I will admire you from a distance safe enough that I do not have to reckon with the complexity of who you actually were. Laura deserves better than reverence. She deserves reckoning. So let us reckon. She was born in Pepin, Wisconsin in February of 1867, the second daughter of a man who could not stop moving, and a woman who could not make him stop. She spent her childhood being taken apart and reassembled in different states, always in the wake of her father's conviction that the next place would be better, always watching her mother's face when that conviction turned out to be wrong again. She learned early, before she had language for it, that security was not a given, that home was not a place but a practice, that the people around you could love you completely and still not protect you from the thing that was coming next, that education did not leave her. It went into her bones, into the part of the nervous system that decides, before the conscious mind has caught up, as to whether the current situation is safe or whether you should already be planning your exit. She carried it with her from Wisconsin to Kansas to Minnesota, to Iowa, to Dakota Territory, to Spring Valley, Minnesota, to Westville, Florida, to Smet, to Mansfield, Missouri. She carried it the entire way, and then she sat down at 63 and made it into books that felt like peace. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, one of the most remarkable acts of transformation in American literary history. To take a childhood defined by instability and loss, and the particular exhaustion of being the child of a man whose dreams were bigger than his capacity to hold on to them, and to alchemize it, through 60 years of living and a decade of writing, into something that feels to the reader like warmth and safety, and the deep satisfaction of a life that makes sense. She did not do it by forgetting. She did it by choosing. Every sentence in those books is a choice. Every scene that appears is a scene that Laura decided deserved to appear, and every scene that does not appear, the Spring Valley year, the unnamed son, the years of dressmaking in Smet, the Florida experiment, the long grinding poverty of the Ozark hillside before the apple trees finally bore fruit, is equally a choice, equally deliberate, equally shaped by a mind that understood with absolute clarity what the books were for. What were they for? They were for the child who needed to know that difficulty was not the end, that a family could lose everything and still have each other, and that having each other was, in the final accounting, the only thing that could not be taken by weather or disease or failed crops or burned houses. They were for the Depression-era adult who was watching everything they had built dissolve and who needed a story that said, "People have survived this before and survived it with their love intact, and you can too." They were for Rose. Whether Laura consciously intended this or not, the Little House books are, among many other things, a letter from a mother to a daughter that could not be said any other way. A letter that said, "This is where you came from. This is the people we are. This is the shape of the life that made you. Here it is, made clean and ordered and beautiful, because that is the only way I know how to give it to you." They were for Almanzo, who would never write a word of his own experience, who left no memoir and no diary, and no account of what it felt like to spend 61 years walking with a cane through the fields of a farm he built with hands that had been partially broken by a disease he contracted at 31. Laura wrote Farmer Boy, the story of Almanzo's prosperous New York childhood, the only Little House book that is not about Laura, as a gift to the man who never asked for one. She gave him back his strength, his horses, his boyhood on a farm that worked the way farms were supposed to work. She gave him, in the only medium she had, the self he had lost. And the books were for herself. Because the act of making something orderly out of chaos, of imposing the shape of story on the raw material of experience, is one of the ways that human beings survive experience that cannot otherwise be survived. The therapy of narrative is not a modern invention. Laura Ingalls! Wilder knew it without being told, the way she knew most things, by living it first and understanding it afterward. Here is something that rarely gets said about Laura Ingalls Wilder, because it does not fit comfortably with the sunbonnet image. She was ambitious, not in the restless, undirected way of her father, who kept moving because staying in one place long enough to see whether a dream would work out was more frightening than moving on to the next one. But in the particular, Yeah, a focused ambition of someone who knows exactly what they want to build and is willing to do whatever is necessary to build it. She wanted the books to succeed. She worked toward their success with the same methodical attention she had brought to ploughing fields and preserving food and managing a household on nothing, except that this time the harvest she was working toward was not apples or butter or eggs. It was permanence. It was the particular permanence that comes from writing something down in a form that other people will carry forward after you're gone. She had watched her parents' lives disappear almost entirely from the historical record. Charles Ingalls died in 1902, before any of the books were written. His photograph appears in biographies and museum displays now because of the books. Without the books, he would be a name on a census form and a grave in Smet. Caroline Ingalls died in 1924, 8 years before the first book was published. She survived into the era of the books as a character, Ma, patient and strong and keeping a clean house, rather than as a woman, which was perhaps the best memorial Laura could construct for her. Laura watched her parents become historical in real time, and she decided that she would not simply let that happen to her own story. She would shape it. She would decide what was remembered and what was not, what was illuminated and what was left in shadow. She would exercise the only form of control available to a woman of her era and her circumstances, the control of the pen. She picked it up late. She was past 60 when the first book was published, but she used it with the skill of someone who had been watching and listening and filing everything away her entire life, waiting for the moment when she could finally say it. Let us spend a moment with the relationship that is most misunderstood in the Little House story. Rose Wilder Lane is often cast as the villain of the piece, the domineering daughter who commandeered her mother's manuscripts and imposed her own sensibility on a simpler woman's simple memories. The woman who rewrote her mother's story so thoroughly that questions of authorship have occupied scholars for generations. The literary daughter who could not help remaking her mother's raw material in her own more sophisticated image. This reading is not entirely wrong, but it is not entirely fair either. Rose was a complicated person in her own right, a woman of extraordinary intellectual range and restless political conviction, a libertarian thinker who would eventually be identified as one of the founding figures of American modern conservatism, an author whose own novels were far more ambitious and far less commercially successful than her mother's children's books. She travelled the world, she covered wars, she interviewed heads of state and wrote for the most prestigious magazines of the 1920s and 1930s. She was, in the truest sense, a citizen of a wider world than her mother had ever lived in. But she was also a daughter, and the relationship between the two women was, for all its professional tension and ideological distance, one of profound and complicated love. They fought. They disagreed about money, about politics, about the nature of the books themselves. Rose wanted Laura to be bolder, more literary, less constrained by the narrative conventions of children's fiction. Laura wanted the books to be what they needed to be, which was accessible and warm and true to the memory she was honouring, even if that truth was selective. The negotiation between them produced something neither could have built alone. What is less often discussed is what Rose understood about her mother's silence. Rose knew, by the time they were deep into the Little House collaboration in the 1930s and 1940s, that there were parts of her parents' story that Laura would not put into any book. She knew about the difficulties of the early marriage years, or some of them. She did not know about the dead brother until the 1950s, but she knew about the hardships, the moves, the poverty of the Missouri years, the way her parents had arrived at Rocky Ridge with almost nothing and built it into a life. She had been there for some of it. She had grown up on the hillside. She had watched her mother carry the weight of a household that needed more than it had, and she respected the silence. Not because she agreed with it, necessarily. Rose was not constitutionally disposed to silence about difficult truths, but because she understood that the silence was her mother's choice to make, and that the books they were constructing together were not a documentary. They were a story, and the story had a shape that required certain things to be outside its borders. The collaboration between Laura and Rose is not a story of a simple woman exploited by a more sophisticated one. It is a story of two strong-willed, brilliant women negotiating the space between memory and myth, between what happened and what should be said about what happened, between the past as it was lived and the past as it needs to be told. That negotiation, conducted across years of letters and manuscript exchanges and visits to Rocky Ridge, produced something that has outlasted both of them. And that too is a kind of legacy worth honouring. Rocky Ridge Farm in its final form was 200 acres. 200 acres of Ozark hillside developed over 4 decades from the 40 rocky, wooded, debt-laden acres that Laura purchased with her $100 savings in September of 1894. The farmhouse that Almanzo built, 10 rooms, constructed slowly over years, from timber cut on their own land, fitted together with the patience of a man who had learned, out of necessity, to work in a lower gear than his former self, was a genuine home. Not a claim shanty, not a borrowed room in someone else's house. A home that was theirs, legally and practically and emotionally, in every sense of the word that mattered. The apple orchard that had been 800 young trees in nursery rows when they arrived became a productive operation that provided income for decades. Almanzo developed expertise in Ozark fruit growing that was recognised beyond Wright County. He wrote occasional pieces for agricultural publications, drawing on decades of observation of what the Rocky Ridge soil and climate would and would not support. The Wilder farm became eventually one of the most productive in the region. Laura became a writer for the Missouri Ruralist in 1911. Farm papers, practical advice columns, observations on rural life aimed at farm wives who were her neighbours and her peers. She wrote under her own name, with her own voice, and she was good at it from the beginning. The column ran for over a decade. It taught her something that no amount of ambition or natural talent could have taught her on its own. It taught her to write for an audience, to know who was reading and what they needed, to calibrate the emotional content and the practical content and the narrative arc of a piece so that it landed where it was intended to land. She was 63 when she wrote the first Little House book, but she'd been practicing for 50 years. There is a photograph of Laura Ingalls Wilder taken in her later years. She's sitting at a desk, a real desk, the kind that implies permanence, that implies someone has decided they will be in this place long enough to own furniture, and she's looking directly into the camera. She's not smiling, or rather she's not performing the smile that women of her era were expected to perform for cameras. Her face is composed and watchful and intelligent. The eyes are the eyes of someone who has seen more than they have said. That photograph is, in its way, the truest image we have of her. Not the sunbonnet girl running through prairie grass, not the iconic book cover portrait with the carefully arranged expression of serene pioneer womanhood, but this, an old woman at her desk looking at you directly, with a gaze that says, "I know what I know, and I have decided what to tell you about it." That is the Laura who matters, the one who made choices, the one who understood narrative as power, not the power of domination, but the power of definition, the power of deciding which version of the past will be carried forward. She exercised that power from a position of extraordinary vulnerability. She was a woman of limited formal education, limited financial resources for most of her life, limited social standing in the broader world of letters. She did not go to university. She did not have a literary network. She did not benefit from the kind of professional infrastructure that male writers of her era took as a given. She had her memories, her intelligence, her daughter's skills, and the particular unflinching attention to human experience that 60 years of surviving difficulty had built into her. That was enough. It was more than enough. The Spring Valley Methodist Church on West Cortlandt Street holds its windows against the Minnesota light in the same way it has held them for 150 years. The stained glass, 21 windows in the Victorian Gothic style, intact and preserved, casts the same coloured light across the same wooden pews that it cast in 1890, when Laura and Almanzo sat in them every Sunday, dependent and quiet and enduring. The Wilder barn stands on its private property on the northwest corner of Spring Valley, its wood seasoned by over a century and a half of Minnesota winters. It is a visible piece of the world Laura inhabited during the years she never wrote, a solid and physical, undeniable artifact of the time and place she spent 60 years leaving out. The church is open to visitors now. It is run as a museum by the Spring Valley Community Historical Society. If you stand in it on a bright afternoon and look at the light through the glass, you can think about what it meant to be 23 years old in that building, to be wearing your best dress and your best composure, to be the daughter-in-law of the man who had helped pay for the windows you were looking through, knowing that nothing in the room was yours and everything in your situation was borrowed. And then you can think about what it meant, 40 years later, to be an old woman in Missouri, to have built something that was entirely yours, to have made the borrowed year into silence and the silence into story, and the story into something that would live on shelves in libraries across the country after you were gone. That distance, from the borrowed pew in 1890 to the desk at Rocky Ridge where the books were written, is the real pioneer story. Not the one in the books, the one underneath the books, the one the books were built to protect. There is a grave in Smet, South Dakota, in a cemetery that sits on the flat Dakota land under a wide sky that has not changed since the Ingalls family first came to town. The headstone reads, "Baby son of A.J. Wilder." He had no first name that history preserved. He lived for 27 days in the summer of 1889. His mother was 22 years old when she buried him. His father stood at the graveside with a body that was already failing him from the diphtheria of the previous year. His sister Rose was 2 years old and did not know what a cemetery meant. His mother carried him in silence for 60 years. She carried the Spring Valley year in silence for 60 years. She carried the burned house and the cane and the $150 and the elderly in-laws' kitchen and the borrowed Sunday dresses in silence for 60 years. And then she sat down at her desk at Rocky Ridge Farm and she made it into something else entirely. She made it into Pa's fiddle, and the long winter and the silver lake and the little house in the big woods. Or she made it into something so beautiful that millions of children read it and grew up and gave it to their own children, and that children who are alive tonight are falling asleep to even now, in bedrooms across the country, with the books on the shelves beside them. That transformation, from the weight of what was buried to the lightness of what was told, is the real story of Laura Ingalls Wilder. It is a story about what it costs to survive, what it costs to carry grief without letting it consume you, what it costs to live dependent when you were raised to value independence, and to keep going anyway, and to find, in an old man's farm in southeastern Minnesota, in a church full of borrowed light, in a small house on a rocky Ozark hillside with 800 apple trees waiting in their rows, the slow, daily, unglamorous materials of a life worth building. She built it. It took her 90 years. It took her everything she had, but she built it. And the evidence is everywhere. In the books, yes, but also in the barn that still stands, in the church that still holds its windows, in the grave marker that says only baby son, in the church records that confirm 2 quiet names, in a Spring Valley ledger, Almanzo and Laura, 1890 and 1891. She was there. She endured it. She came out the other side, and she made it beautiful. That is the whole story. Sleep well.